Alright. You've been loving you, the hypothetical person that would hypothetically listen to whatever I'm saying here because the world cares so much. But just in the, off chance that any of you younglings traveling the college path ever even comes across this book and has to read it, here it is, chapter 3 of Disciple Making Culture by Brandon Guindon. Let's start on the title, right? Alright, title Frame It. Chapter 3 Create a framework of biblical values and common language. In Jesus' days, disciples considered it an honor and a privilege to follow their teacher. Not everyone made the cut. That's why disciples were incredibly grateful when they were chosen by a teacher. They knew it they knew it would be a life-changing journey. When Jesus called his disciples to follow him, his disciples surely would have felt the honor and privilege. But Jesus' disciple-making style paints a very different picture from the fame and glory the disciples may have been expecting. From the very beginning, Jesus redefined what it means to be his disciple, and this is still true for his disciples today. Jesus doesn't promise us fame, fortune, and privilege. In fact, Jesus uses ominous words to call disciples himself, words that involve loss, sacrifice, and even death. And then there is a green square of the cute phrase, which is a theme that we're going to see reoccurring in every single chapter. And this green cute square says, we need to properly frame the concept of being a disciple of Jesus. All right. This is why we need to properly frame the concept of being a disciple of Jesus, just like the green square. When we build a culture of disciple making at our church, Jesus was calling his followers to something very different than what they had known. Like so many other concepts, Jesus redefined terms in his day, and these new terms carry with them implications, even for our culture today. In the 3 years that his disciples followed him, Jesus framed the concept of disciple making in a way that instituted a completely different understanding of what it meant to be discipled. He called the ordinary and average person to follow him. More than just recite from the Old Testament, he modeled biblical truth and even allowed his disciples to participate in his ministry. What Jesus offered, what Jesus offered his followers was much more than just an opportunity to come listen to a great teacher. He shared his life with his disciples and invited them into a culture that changed their lives. That's what we must do as well. Since people today aren't used to being discipled in their first place, that's a tall order. In the first place. I said their first place, but it's for free, so you have to accept it. I am kidding. Alright, but really not. Establishing clear definitions. From the beginning of our church, our little group that God called to plant real life ministries, Texas, knew we needed to frame the process of disciple making as Jesus did. So we spent hours together in the living room or sometimes the backyard when the Houston heat let up, discussing Jesus' definition of a disciple. This was hard for me because we had already done this at Real Life Ministries in Idaho, but I knew buy-in for our new church was important. We had to discover it afresh as a group because I wanted to be lockstep with our core team. I strongly recommended I strongly recommend doing the same with your team, whether your church is young or well established. Our eclectic eclectic group of about 20 people had different ideas of what it meant to be a disciple and how to make a disciple, but we all agreed that we wanted to live out and define our terms as close to those in the biblical framework as possible, and not just by definitions on a page, but also by how we lived out those definitions. Several people from our group came to the table with a common definition of a disciple we see today, that what I call the classroom concept. A disciple in this understanding is someone who memorizes scripture and studies the Bible. There is nothing wrong with either of those things. In fact, they're important, but the life of Christ and the culture he formed went way beyond Sunday morning class or Wednesday night Bible study. So as a group, we all worked hard to define and then live out what we meant when we asked others to join us in cultivating a disciple-making culture within this new church plant. My job as the lead planter was to ensure that this happened. I needed to frame the biblical foundations for our culture by establishing a biblical context with clear, unifying definitions, getting on the same page. I remember how important it was for my football coach to clearly frame the words we use and the definitions behind those terms. I vividly recall arriving on my college campus and reporting for football practice as a freshman. Guys from all over the United States were making their way to the practice facilities. As a rookie, I was nervous. It was early in the morning, and the August sun was already making the air hot and sticky. Two-a-day practices were about to start, and I was sweating from anxiety and temperatures in the high 90s. The jump from high school to college football meant everything that had once been familiar was about to change. The tension of excitement and fear wrestled around my heart, and I hoped I would not die on the first day or make a complete fool of myself. Yes, we'd be playing football, but an entirely new team culture lay ahead of me. Would I fit in? When a coach asked me to execute a drill, would I know what to do? When the coach called plays, would I know what he was asking of me? Questions like these swirled in my mind. Had it not been for the clarity found in the playbook, I might have quit. We were tested for 2 days, given all our gear, and by our first practice, everything was a blur. Coaches were screaming, everyone was running around the field, and all the freshmen were trying to adjust to the fast-paced world of college football. I'll never forget the most difficult part, and it wasn't the physical demands, joint rattling hits, or pace of practice. Those quickly fell down the list. Communication became the name of the game, and skyrocketed to the top of the list as the most difficult aspect of college football, because it was more mental than physical at that point. Adjusting to new language and definitions of terms shook my confidence, and I needed help. I needed some frame of reference to guide me through the haze of playing a new game. That's why I was so thankful the coaches put a playbook in our hands. It took a while to get all the plays down, but from the beginning, along with my classroom studies, learning the new football vocabulary was at the top of my to-do list. My freshman year of college, I felt like I was starting over with everything I knew and understood about football. That's how it is with church culture. As you begin to frame a new disciple making culture at your church, people will feel like you're handing them a new playbook. That's okay. In fact, it's normal. In order to cultivate thriving disciple makers, it is critical that everyone in your church understand the key words you use and how you define them. So form the playbook with your team, not on your own in a silo, then communicate it well to the whole church. That is another green box that says everyone in your church must understand the keywords you use. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Consider how important this was for a new church like ours. Our little group that met in a living room soon would grow, and many new families would join our church. Sure enough, new believers and longtime churchgoers alike soon came to our church with either no understanding or a preconceived understanding of the terms we were using. Somehow we had to align them. That's what framing a culture of disciple making means, putting it all into a framework that makes sense. Framing starts with leaders, staff members, and key lay leaders. You need to clearly understand, define, and live out your mission critical terms. Your mission critical terms. Mission critical is one word here. Mission critical terms. Otherwise, your effectiveness will flounder, which also means to go down. I'm foreign, please bear with me. Settling for an unclear or loose frame creates a culture of confusion, where a congregation hears the words you're using but doesn't understand them or leave them out. Why? Because when people don't understand what to do, they have a hard time doing anything at all. Define your terms. Several months ago, I received a call from a man I will call Dave, which is a fake name for this man. It's in between quotations. Over the phone, I could hear Dave's excitement as he shared with me his calling to plant a church with several others. He wanted to meet with me so he could ask me questions about what God had taught me in my journey. He was familiar with Jim Putman from Real Life Ministries in Idaho and the work God had done in all of us as part of our network of churches over the years. We booked a meeting at our church with him and his 4 team members. At our meeting time 2 weeks later, my staff team and I greeted Dave and his team at the front of our building. After we introduced our teams and chatted over coffee, I could tell the small talk was over. Dave wanted to get right down to business. His expression beamed with intensity, and his speech quickened with an eagerness to understand how we had gone from 5 families meeting in a house to over 600 regular attendees in our first 2 years. The 4 others with him seemed just as eager to hear the story. There we sat, my whole team with his whole team. After briefly sharing some of the backstory and my personal journey, I began to talk about our unity and clarity around the definition of the term disciple and other key terms. I told him about our hours of working through and wrestling with terminology. The more I shared with him about the culture we had created and what it looked like to live it out, the more impatient he seemed to get. My concern grew because from his facial expressions, I got the sense that he was missing the point. So I stopped and asked him, "What are you hearing me say?" Dave replied, "You've defined a disciple." "Yeah, I get that. And we as a group have already done that. I want to understand what systems or curriculum you are using that have helped you grow so fast." In that moment, I was proud of two things. First, how my team sat quietly and did not say anything, and second, that I did not spit out my coffee at his answer. I took a deep breath and replied to him with with an on-the-top assignment. I knew that this assignment would make him see how his team was not aligned. I knew they were not aligned by two observations. One, by seeing the expressions on their faces as Dave described how well his team knew the vision of their church, and two, by listening to how they talked as a team. During our brief small talk right before the meeting time and during our coffee chat, I asked I had asked questions about their progress and received an array of answers. Each member of his team was excited, but as a team, no two of them seemed to be on the same page. I asked one person in particular about their definition of a disciple, and he looked completely confused, so I was prepared for a moment of potential revelation for them. I pushed my chair back from the table and looked at their team's expectant faces. They were convinced I was about to unveil the holy grail of curriculum that would double the size of their congregation. Instead, I replied, "Before I answer your question about curriculum, I would like each of you to write on a piece of paper your definition of a disciple." The pastor nervously looked around at his team and clicked the pen in his hand. They all began to scribble on the paper in front of them. How many different answers do you think they wrote between the 5 of them? If you guessed 5, you're right. The pastor's face turned red, and as each answer was read out loud, the pastor's face became a deeper shade of red. This exercise revealed the point he needed to understand. Sensing both Dave's embarrassment and anger, I jumped in. "Dave, I did this exercise to make a point about people in general, not about your team. We as leaders often make huge assumptions that once we say a term, or even preach about it once or twice, then our teams, leaders, and members should have the concept locked in forever. But nothing could be further from the truth." He understood what I was saying and accepted that they had some work to do. The beginning of the conversation we had with Dave and his team completely changed the direction of the visit, as well as their expectations for the rest of our conversation. They came in expecting to be handed a curriculum or a staffing structure that would give them a roadmap for disciple making. Instead, I shifted the focus of our conversation away from the mechanics of disciple making toward the idea of culture. Words have meaning. Sorry, I just had to scratch my ear like the primate that I am. God forbid, that was a joke. Alright, the mistake Dave and many leaders make is assuming that they've already laid the foundation for cultivating a culture of disciple making. But leaders have to be able to articulate a clear definition and personally live out the definition to properly frame a culture of disciple making. Typing out a doctrinal statement or even writing a slogan on a bulletin is not enough to shape an entire church culture. Some say that we must hear something 1,000 times to really own it. Think of how many times and in how many ways Jesus defined for the 12 what it looked like to be his disciple. Everything Jesus did pointed back to being his disciple. Again, culture is a way of life that stretches beyond what we could ever scribble on a page. Imagine if Jesus had asked the 12 to be his disciples, but never gave them a framework for what that would look like. Being his disciple would have lost its unique meaning. If you were to ask a total of 10 staff members or leaders in your church to define a disciple, would they all define it in the same way, or would you get 10 different answers? Cultivating a disciple-making culture with a biblical foundation requires that we define and use biblical terms, which is what God, the author of the Bible, intended for us. Consider how Jesus clearly framed being his disciple in Matthew 4:19. Quote, "And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.'" Unquote. Matthew 4:19. NASB. No idea what that means. In this passage, we see the definition in the invitation. A disciple is one who is following Christ, being changed by Christ, and on the mission of Christ. Now, Jesus' call to follow him isn't a definition, as we talk about definitions today, but in his culture, it served as his definition. He framed disciple making early and often. In fact, Jesus spent over 3 years giving an absolutely crystal clear picture of not only what it means to be his disciple, but also how to make disciples. So when he gave the Great Commission to his disciples, they knew and had context for exactly what the call to follow Jesus meant and how to accomplish it. Jesus framed it, and even now, as his disciples who follow his method, open parenthesis, not just his mission or message, close parenthesis, we too must frame it. We use the Matthew 4:19 passage, cited above, to frame disciple making in the real life ministry Texas culture, but that's not the only way to do it. There are different ways to frame it with a biblical foundation, and each church must use contextual language, but it must all go back in some way to following Jesus as he defines it. We keep our definition from Matthew 4:19 in front of our people all the time. I preach sermons on it, we train leaders using it, and we consistently discuss it in staff, elder, and volunteer meetings. Disciple is defined and remains a constant for us as we shape our culture of disciple making. My team and I described for Dave, from the story above, how we live out our definition of being a disciple and how we model for those in our church what it looks like to follow, be changed by, and be on the mission of Christ. We also discuss other critical terms that must be defined, framed, and lived out to have a healthy culture. Dave eventually came to the realization that their culture was hindered because he expected his team, along with their average churchgoer, to know, live, believe, and agree to their leadership definition of terms without clear communication about these terms and definitions. Dave's story is common among church leaders today. They often want strategy, tactics, and curriculum, but what they really lack is culture of disciple making. Is a culture of disciple making. In order to truly focus on culture, we need to explicitly define the terms which establish and support the framework of our culture. The two terms leaders must start with are disciple and gospel. We have defined the term disciple above. And for gospel, I recommend a powerful book called The Discipleship Gospel by my friends Bill Hu and Ben Sobos. This is an excellent resource for helping you define the gospel. The gospel we preach and the disciples we make. I caution you to skip over defining the gospel. I caution you to not skip over defining the gospel too quickly. Yeah, that would sound better than, skipping over too quickly. Anyways, getting your church's understanding of the gospel right is vital to the culture because it has to do with our personal understanding of the why of discipleship. I realized the importance of this in a very clear way during a conversation I had with a man I met in the early days of our church plant. We met at one of my daughter's softball games since his daughter was on the team as well. He and I quickly struck up a friendship because we had many things in common, including our love for the outdoors and our faith. We exchanged phone numbers and I invited him to coffee at my favorite coffee shop. Time went on and we began to spend time together outside of our girls' softball games. Lunch here, coffee there, baga, American stuff. And our conversations gravitated toward the church God had called me to plant and our personal theology. I thought he might be interested in joining the ministry of our church until one day while we were riding together on our way to have lunch on this casual car ride, he suddenly made a statement that Christians must do works to earn God's grace. What? I thought. I heard the brakes screech in my mind. I asked him, what do you mean by earn God's grace? Well, I mean that unless I do certain things in my life, he said, I just do not believe that God could really save me. For the next 2 hours, we sat in a parking lot and discussed God's grace and how grace is a free gift, regardless of the scriptures I used or the passion with which I spoke. He refused to even entertain my perspective. While we both had a deep theology, he held a deep, staunch, and works-based salvation position. Because of his upbringing and certain events in his life, he just could not see the grace of God as a free gift. We still remain friends to this day, but unfortunately, we agreed to disagree, and thus parted ways in our ministry paths. Before we can effectively cultivate a Jesus style disciple making culture, we need to ensure our gospel comes from Jesus and nowhere else. It's not just about the gospel, though. How we define all the major foundation terms of our church will provide infrastructure for our culture. It's like my college football team. When we had to understand what a coach meant by a term he used, when a play was called, I what? When a play was called, I and 10 other guys had to be unified on what to do. A healthy culture needs unity around the critical terms. This is not just terms like gospel, disciple, and discipleship, but also terms like relation and small groups. Yeah, I feel like I have to reread that because you guys might be twice as confused as I am. It's like my college football team when we had to understand what a coach meant by the term he used. Okay. When the play was called, I and 10 other guys had to be unified on what to do. A healthy culture needs unity around the critical terms. This is not just terms like gospel, disciple, and discipleship, but also terms like relationship and small groups. Clarity on the definitions of these terms and how to live them out is what builds our biblical foundation for how we function. This practice significantly impacts the culture we create. I can only imagine what life would have been like for me if I had arrived at practice as a freshman without ever having seen the playbook. The coaches would have expected me to know all the plays, terms, and calls on our team, but I would have been completely lost. The gospel is page the gospel is page one of Jesus' playbook. Oh, okay. The gospel is page one of Jesus' playbook, and we've got to start there so that we don't get lost. Play is page one? So odd. In the discipleship gospel, which is a book his friend wrote, and he recommends it if you don't remember. I do because I just read it. In the discipleship gospel, which I mentioned above, Bill Hu and Ben Sobels write about the importance of defining the gospel and how that determines the disciples we make. The gospel you preach determines the disciples you make. This statement has great depth to it, and when we lack a clear definition for what we do, we can miss our target and end up creating something we never intended to create. In fact, their book also offers a definition of what they call the discipleship gospel, and this definition includes following Jesus with the call of the gospel message itself. Without this, we're missing out on the whole picture. Part of the reason we have trouble making disciples in the church, they conclude, is that many people don't even believe that's what they signed up for when they accepted the good news of Jesus. So we must deal first with the gospel, then go to culture. This is all part of framing the gospel. The primary issue at hand is this: our definitions do not always match the reality of the way Jesus intentionally lived his life and discipled others. Disciple others. We face an enemy who wishes to destroy us, and his choice weapon is to confuse language as he sows seeds of discord at the thought level. For a healthy culture of disciple making to exist, we must have clear language. As leaders, we must teach this, speak about it often, and live it out on a consistent basis. These practices are how we frame it, and the result, by the grace of God, is a successful disciple making culture with people who function as a team. It's not just framing it that counts, it's also sticking to how we frame it, which can be even more challenging. Over the long haul, framing it only matters if you adhere to it, which is what I cover next. Key definitions for a disciple making culture. As you finish this chapter, by the way, this is a big rectangular green box, not as good as the other ones, but it's okay. As you finish this chapter, I recommend you utilize a worksheet we created called Key Definitions for Disciple Making Culture. This worksheet contains a A simple list of critical words with definitions to help you and your team create your own definitions of critical terms. Visit himbublictions.com/culture to download this document and get it 99 cents free. Go, 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 go. By now, you should better understand that rarely do people offer clear definitions of key terms. To intentionally keep your church's focus on disciple-making culture, you must frame the words you use in a way that people can easily understand and repeat them. Your people must know how you define terms. This can be difficult to do. That's why I created this worksheet with sample definitions for important terms. This exercise goes beyond doctrinal statements and helps you and your team get practical about clarifying definitions. Visit himbublictions.com/culture and download this document that will help you create clear definitions for your church or ministry. Alright, that's the end of chapter 3. Thankfully. Not too bad of a chapter, but it's also 5 a.m. in the morning and I haven't slept. Alright guys, hope you enjoy. Or not. Just get your work done.